I'll be honest. When I picked up Capcom's 2019 Resident Evil 2 remake, I wasn't very interested in the story of the game, nor did I expect much from it. In fact, I just assumed that the game's story was going to be pretty awful, which is why I was surprised to find that the more I played, the more I discovered that there is actually a lot to like in there. I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion. After all, Resident Evil games are not known by or played for their story. But I think that the story of Resident Evil 2 is actually a lot deeper than it appears at first glance. Specifically, what I find really interesting is the way in which the game approaches the theme of family, particularly as it relates to the concepts of abuse, neglect, and a sense of absence and abandonment. At the same time, however, I am very puzzled by some of the decisions taken in regards to the structure of the story. And to take this a step further, I even wonder what the story would look like if some of its elements were to be modified or rearranged. Either way, I think that there is a lot in this narrative that is worth delving into, and that's what I want to explore in this analysis. For the sake of clarity, I need to specify that the discussion in this video will pertain to the canon version of the story. There are two playable characters in this game, Claire and Leon, which means there are two ways to play this game. You can start your first playthrough with Claire, and then, once you beat the game, you unlock a second playthrough, referred to as V scenario or second scenario, that takes place with Leon, and vice versa. The main structure of the game remains the same regardless of character choice, with some cutscenes and other details modified to fit the chosen protagonist. From what I understand, the way to play the game that has been confirmed as canon is starting with Claire first and then moving on to Leon for the second playthrough. And this actually makes perfect sense to me because the central elements of the game's story in general definitely seem to be written with Claire in mind. Leon's story is not very good in my opinion. He has no real connection to any of the antagonists of the game, and his character pretty much remains a blank throughout the entirety of the story. In a weird way, Leon comes off to me more as a secondary character to Ada's story. She's the one who actually changes and grows. Her worldview is, if not shattered, at least cracked by Leon's naive sappiness. Leon, on the other hand, has no real motivation. Even the feelings he develops for Ada are just there for the sake of moving the story forward, which is not the case with Ada herself, whose feelings for Leon are actually developed and complicated in an organic way. This is all to say that the real heart of Resident Evil 2's story lies within Claire's side of the story. Leon's story provides a more common and more expected action zombie narrative. There's a mystery involving a shady corporation trying to turn humans into bioweapons, deranged scientists, double crossings, good-looking people falling in love with each other, and a few other twists along the way. Claire's story, on the other hand, gives us a much more personal take on the overdone genre of zombie horror, one that revolves around the themes of family and family dysfunction, abuse, neglect, and abandonment. And I find this really interesting, that amidst this zombie apocalypse, there's this emotional core that explores the theme of families falling apart, but also of new families being formed. I have the feeling that Claire's side of the story is kind of problematic. While Leon's story has him falling in love with a mysterious woman, even as he unravels a conspiracy in which the whole world is at stake, Claire's story has her taking care of a child. The reason I think this works, however, is because, as I said earlier, Leon's story is boring and forgettable compared to Claire's, which actually has a very interesting depth to it. One thing I find fascinating about Claire's story is the way it focuses on three female characters and their relationship to each other: Claire herself, Sherry, and Sherry's mother, Annette. And when male characters are involved in the story, they are usually either absent, like Claire's brother Chris and even Leon, who disappears right at the beginning of the story, or they take the role of abusers. Police Chief Irons becomes a distorted and abusive father figure for Sherry in a scene that happens in an orphanage of all places, while William, Sherry's biological father, has literally mutated into a monstrous creature who stalks Sherry.
I'm coming for you, Sherry! Get over here, you little bitch! The game is over! No! Now you're in trouble!
Let me go! No, stop!
Unlike Leon, Claire also has a clear motivation, one that is beautifully established by the very first lines of dialogue in the opening cinematic, in which we see Claire speaking to an unknown person over the phone. In one brief line, the game first establishes that Claire is in Raccoon City to look for her brother Chris, and then, after Claire hangs up the phone, she says something to herself that I find fascinating. She says, "Why does everyone think I'm going to get in trouble?" This is a line of dialogue that I completely ignored at first as being inconsequential. It doesn't seem to uphold any importance, and the way in which it's delivered is very light. Claire says it almost as a joke to herself. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that this line gives us a very subtle insight into Claire's background. It tells us, without telling us, that Claire feels like nobody in her life has faith in her. There is a tone of abandonment in this line, one that complements the feeling of yearning that Claire's search for Chris represents. After Claire makes it to the RPD, she encounters Marvin Branagh for the first time, who comments on Claire's ability to defend herself. Claire responds by saying that, quote-unquote, someone taught her, this being an allusion to Chris, and once again, we have a very subtle line that tells us a lot. Chris might be the one person in Claire's life that she can depend on, the one person that believes in her. But as we quickly learn, Chris is not even in Raccoon City. Claire suddenly finds herself completely alone, even as a hellish and terrifying reality unravels around her. This sense of abandonment and absence, this image of a fractured family, this yearning for connection are what comprises the central emotional drive of Claire's story, and they are further explored when the character of Sherry is introduced. Sherry's story is built around the theme of family dysfunction. Sherry's parents are the scientists who created the virus that led to the zombie outbreak in Raccoon City. When the player first runs into her, it looks as though she has been abandoned. We learn later that Sherry's father has turned into a hideous monster who now stalks her. Her mother, on the other hand, does not seem to care about Sherry at all. Sherry is caught between these two extremes, a monstrous father who constantly chases her, and a mother who seemingly couldn't care less about her. Like Claire, Sherry feels abandoned, and this feeling is ultimately what brings the two of them together. After learning that Chris is not in the city, Claire's motivation becomes simply to survive. That is, until she runs into Sherry, who seems to be lost in the underground level of the RPD. This encounter leads into the game's first boss fight against G, who, unbeknownst to Claire, is actually Sherry's father. Once the fight is over, Sherry tells Claire that her parents are, quote-unquote, gone, and the two of them bond over the fact that they're both alone, their families absent. Soon after, Sherry is kidnapped by Chief Irons, who takes her to an orphanage close by. The orphanage itself is symbolic of the themes of abandonment and broken families, and the sequence that takes place there plays out like a twisted inversion of family life as Chief Irons chases Sherry through a room full of children's toys. The story up to this point is consistent, but I'm puzzled by some of the decisions made in regards to its structure. Here's the thing. Remember when I said Leon's character remains a blank throughout the whole story? If I'm being honest, the same thing can kind of be said about Claire too, which is frustrating because all of the elements to make her a good character are already in place. They are just not implemented very well. And this is where the issues with story structure come into play. I don't understand why the reveal that Chris is not in Raccoon City happens so soon in the story, literally right after the player enters the first level of the game. Revealing Chris's absence so early immediately takes away Claire's central motivation. I wonder what the story would look like if this reveal would have been unveiled at a later point. Specifically, I think that the best time for this reveal to happen would be after Sherry is kidnapped. This is how I imagine the story could have gone. Claire's initial motivation is to find Chris. In her search, she would run into Sherry and bond with her because they are both part of a broken family. Then, when Sherry is kidnapped, Claire would be faced with a choice to make. Does she continue on with her own journey, or does she go out of her way to save Sherry, risking her life in the process? She didn't go to Raccoon City for Sherry after all. As it is right now, though, I think Claire falls into the role of hero way too quickly. As soon as Sherry is kidnapped, Claire decides that she'll do anything she must to save her. But I think that a choice like this one needs to linger for a bit to create some tension as the audience/player wonders if Claire will in fact rise to the call or not. Unlike Leon, who is naively righteous to a boring degree, nothing in Claire's character so far has told us that she is the heroic type. And while we can all understand why saving Sherry is the right thing to do, I think that for a character like Claire, we should, at the very least, get some internal conflict over a decision like this one. And this is why I think Chris's reveal should come after this moment in the story. After Sherry is taken, Claire makes her way back to the RPD, landing in Chief Irons' office. And I think this is where Claire should find about Chris. Maybe she finds a document or a letter that lets her know that Chris is, in fact, not even in Raccoon City at all at the time. This sudden discovery that Chris is gone and that she is alone could be the catalyst that pushes Claire to go all out for Sherry. This moment could be the payoff to the setups that the game has established. Claire's yearning to find Chris, as well as the bond she shared with Sherry over their family experience. In the absence of Chris, finding Sherry could become Claire's new motivation, one that carries on the central themes of the story and gives us a more nuanced characterization of Claire. After finding Chris is gone, Claire would decide that she can't abandon Sherry in the same way. And whereas before, Claire was simply passively caught in a zombie apocalypse as she looked for Chris, she would now have to exert agency and choose to actively put her life in danger as she steps into the role of hero. And in her decision to save Sherry, we could see that even as two families are falling apart, a new one is being formed. And if we're just theory crafting here, then we can even go a step further. As I played through the game, I found myself wishing that Capcom would have just made Claire the only playable character, with Leon taking on a supporting role in the story. This was probably not a feasible option in a AAA project like this one due to the expectations of fans of previous games in the series, but it's still fun to think about. The reason I think Leon should be a secondary character in the story is because I think he could fulfill a very important role. In the absence of Chris, Leon would play the role of becoming a brother figure for Claire. Amidst an apocalyptic city infected with zombies, Claire's motivation is to find her brother. This emotional core is more important to the story than the background narrative of a shady corporation making biological weapons. The world might be at stake here, but what truly matters is this narrative of family and abandonment and of new families coming together. These themes inform and deepen everything else in the story, even the characters of Mr. X and Sherry's father, William, also known as G. Mr. X is an enemy that appears halfway through the player's exploration of the RPD. Unlike normal zombies, Mr. X can chase the player through rooms. His role is to pursue the player relentlessly. This is not only terrifying, but it also creates a more personal reaction from the player. Unlike regular zombies, Mr. X is single-mindedly trying to get you, the player, and when you think about it, this is actually fascinating within the context of this story. Mr. X's motivation is to obsessively search for the player, much like Claire's is to search for her brother and G's is to stalk Sherry. As I mentioned before, William and Annette Birkin, Sherry's parents, developed the G virus that led to the zombie apocalypse in Raccoon City. After things went wrong, William injected himself with the virus and started to mutate into the creature known as G. Even as he transforms more and more into a monster, however, G still fights to retain a sense of humanity. He constantly stalks Sherry, saving her on 2 separate occasions. Even as a monster, G is yearning to connect with his daughter. But he is unable to see that his presence now only hurts and scares Sherry. When does love become obsession? When does love become abuse? Sherry's relationship with her mother, however, is even more complicated. At first, it seems like Sherry's mother, Annette, doesn't care about Sherry at all. Annette ignores her daughter, getting into arguments with Claire in the process, whose priority is to rescue Sherry. As it turns out, Annette does care about Sherry, but she's also trying to stop her mutated husband as well as trying to prevent the G virus from getting into the wrong hands. Like Claire, Annette was faced with a choice: save Sherry or prevent the zombie apocalypse that she helped create from spreading, even if that means neglecting her own daughter. Annette decides that the latter option is more important, and that is precisely why she becomes such a good foil for Claire, who simply cannot understand why Annette won't drop everything to save Sherry.
Oh no. Sherry? Claire? Sherry, are you alright? What are you doing? I'm here to help.
Sherry's been implanted. She can't be saved.
Are you fucking kidding me? You're her mother. Get in here!
You don't understand. William is still out there, and if I don't stop him...
This conversation is over!
Wait! Wait! I can treat her. In my lab. It's not far away.
Mommy?
There's not enough time. Millions of lives are at stake. Sherry, Mommy loves you, sweetie. Goodbye.
Are you fucking kidding me? Sherry, don't worry. I will get you whatever you need, okay?
Oh, why are you doing this?
Because I care.
Thank you, Claire.
The Resident Evil series helped pioneer the survival horror genre. As the name implies, these games present to us a terrifying world crawling with horrors and where survival is the most important goal. And yet, there's an interesting story behind the iconic name. The Japanese title for the original Resident Evil game was Biohazard, which had to be changed when imported to the US because of legal reasons, leading to the creation of the alternate title Resident Evil, a title that seems strangely fitting to this analysis. The name Resident Evil almost feels like an allusion to domestic life, but a twisted version of it, one tainted by evil. This resonates with Resident Evil 2's emphasis on family dysfunction and abuse as the underlying emotional drive of the story. Ultimately, the reason I find the story of Resident Evil 2 Remake so captivating is precisely because this game takes a genre full of cliches and infuses it with a more personal narrative that explores the themes of family and family dysfunction, even if the game never quite manages to explore the full potential of its premise. Claire's story takes place in a zombie apocalypse, but her journey is one to connect with her lost family. Claire ultimately fails to find Chris, but instead she ends up finding a new family, one that she cannot bring herself to abandon.
Hey. Are you okay?
Your jacket's so warm.
My brother gave it to me. You know it's supposed to be lucky?
I don't know what I'd do without you.
Are you kidding me? You were doing just fine without me, so I came along and got you all sorts of trouble. I have something of yours.
I don't want it.
Really? Why not? It's so pretty.
It's from my mom. For my birthday last year. All I really wanted was for her to be home more.
I know it seems like your mom doesn't care, but... Hey, Sherry, come here. Hey, hang in there, okay?
Now, arriving at Nest.
It's okay. I've got you.